All right, I'm very pleased to have Mark Ledwich here today. He's one of the authors of this paper that's called Algorithmic Extremism, Examining YouTube's Rabbit Hole of Radicalization. So I've done a video about a topic like this before, actually several, and this is basically one in a line of research that examines the recommendation algorithm of YouTube specifically, but also kind of the general social media platforms. So Mark, thanks for being here. Could you, maybe for people who do not know anything about this, could you kind of explain where your work fits into what's been done before, or kind of also what comes out of the mainstream media about this topic, because there's been quite a bit of talk.
Yeah, so I'm not a researcher by trade, I'm a programmer. And the reason why I got into this was because I could see clear bias in the way the YouTube recommendation system's being reported on, and also in the research. There's some narratives. I think it might be because there's a lot of people worried about right-wing populism, and this is a way to explain that. They're looking for ways YouTube are radicalizing people and finding evidence for that, but that could be anecdotes, or in some of the studies it's sexual quantitative data, but they're only looking to confirm it. So there's really obvious things. I think you covered in your video. Some of them will just look for movement towards alt-right channels through like centrist or alt-light, they call it, instead of looking for both ways. Just really obvious things like that. Calling it an infection that clearly shows they haven't really looked at it like a curious person would. So I thought I could easily, as a software engineer, just collect all the data, and without any complicated statistics, just looking at the overall flow of recommendations between videos, what their political influence is.
Yeah, this was a thing that bugged me of the paper that I made a video about, is that they claim there's this radicalization pipeline, right? And with pipeline, everyone sort of understands a different thing, but I think the general consensus is that the recommendation algorithm itself will steer you towards like more extreme content, and in this case towards like the alt-right extremist content. And the paper actually analyzed and said, okay, we found evidence that there is movement in this direction, but they never shown that this is significantly more movement than like in the other direction. So in order to justify a pipeline, one would need to show that the movement this way is a lot larger than this way in some notion. And so I've actually spoken to the author of that paper, and he agrees with that, but obviously doesn't have like energy to go into every, go refute everything that comes at them. They've also been they've also been exposed to a lot of criticism, let's say, as have you, and I think even more when your paper came out. I think for days there was just a giant storm of people attacking your paper, basically, just listing every single thing that's wrong with it and why this isn't valid and things like this. So let's actually jump into what you did specifically. So if I'm can summarize, and you can then maybe correct, so that we can establish what happened. You basically collected recommendations. So you scraped these videos on YouTube and you collected these recommendations, and we can see this. So in your paper, you then can make such diagrams, such as this one or these, where in the middle the white bar is a channel or a group that you're interested in, and then to the left you can see where all the impressions of that channel or group come from. So where basically the views come from, through the recommendation system. And on the right, you can see of all the views the channel has retrieved, where do they go to? So what is recommended next, right? So it basically shows both directions for every group. And then you've also labeled these by multiple methods so that you can kind of establish these groups. And what is pretty cool, you've built this website where you can analyze this, and my computer is a bit overloaded at the moment, but I promise this is really interactive. All right, so during the interview, my computer crashed, so I'm doing this in post-production. Just to show you how this website operates. So what you have here is an overview over all the channels of what rare recommendations were collected. And they're grouped into groups. For example, here you have the partisan left, center left, social justice, partisan right, and so on. So you can see for each group or channel where recommendations come from and where they go to. For example, the large red one here, I happen to know that is Fox News. You can see Fox News, of the daily impression, it received from itself about 36 million impressions, and it gives to itself 36 million. These numbers have to agree by nature of how the data is collected, of course. But you can also see it gets 2.7 million impressions from CNN, 2.6 million from the Next News Network, and so on. And it also gives quite a bit of recommendations to CNN, and so on. So you can go, for example, at some individual channel. Here's the Daily Wire. The Daily Wire is mainly run by Ben Shapiro, so it's a bit more to the right of Fox News and a bit more on the direction of alternative media. You can see the Daily Wire gets most of its impression count-wise from itself, from the Daily Wire, but it gives most of it to Fox News. So actually, you can see here that itself is a long way down, like in whatever, 6th or 7th place. So actually, if you were to watch the Daily Wire, the recommendation system would most likely steer you towards something like Fox News. Whereas the claim is that the YouTube algorithm would actually steer you towards more radical content. Actually, in reality, it seems like it would steer you towards more of this mainstream content. All right, so actually I want to go to this tab. You can see different groupings here, and the radicalization pathways is the previous paper we have looked at. So they have all these channels here of this radicalization pathway, and you can see here the control group gives very, very, very few impressions to the IDW. The IDW gives much more impressions to the control group, right? Again, and the IDW gives very few impressions to the alt-right compared to the amount of impressions the alt-right gives to the IDW and even to the control group. And if you look at the alt-right, and we're going to zoom in on that here, it's even more. So the alt-right, of course, receives most of its impressions from itself, which you could expect for any kind of group. This is your classic filter bubble situation. But if we analyze the question of, is there a pipeline, you can see that next, most likely, you are diverted to the IDW and to the control group much more than you come from the IDW or the control group, right? Let's look at the alt-right, so-called. This is kind of the so-called gateway to the alt-right. You can see here the alt-right gives most of its impressions next to itself to the control group and the IDW, so de-radicalizing. If you look at its way to the alt-right, you'll see that it gets about 4 times as much impressions from the alt-right as it gives to the alt-right. So basically, it's kind of taking the steam out of a quarter of all of these sessions and gives it to either the control group or the IDW or itself. So this is exactly the opposite of what you would expect if you were to claim that there is a pipeline. You would expect their most recommendations to come from more moderate content and go towards more extreme content. But it's exactly the opposite. And again, these are the exact channels that this original paper used. Now, what this paper found, the one that we're discussing, if you go to media type here, what you'll be able to see is the division into mainstream media, YouTube creator, and so-called missing link media, which we'll leave out for a moment. Let's focus on mainstream versus YouTube creators. You can see the mainstream media gives most recommendations to itself, while giving only very little recommendations to YouTube creators and the missing link media. While the YouTube creators actually give almost half of their impressions. Look at that. They like give almost half of their impressions to the mainstream media, which means that there's a big push by the algorithm towards these mainstream media away from YouTube creators. So in general, and I invite you to look at this website, in general, you can pretty much see that the exact opposite of a radicalization pipeline is happening if you look at these recommendations and how they are distributed. Actually, most recommendation pathways are towards moderate centrist content and of course creating filter bubbles, which is a problem by itself but is not a radicalization pipeline. Lastly, I want to look at white identitarians because it's one of the groups that people are referring to when they claim that there are these radicalization pipelines. Look at that. So of the white identitarian, they get most of their impressions, of course, from other white identitarian videos, which would be your filter bubble phenomenon. But they give most, and this is a group, right? The white identitarian channels give most of their recommendations to the partisan right, to the center and left mainstream media, libertarians, and so on. And themselves are like really, really, really far down. To claim that there is this radicalization pipeline, if you look at this data, to me seems not justified from this data. And if I look at the other paper that really left out the important analysis of the backwards direction, it seems that, given everything, it seems that the claim is not warranted. All right, back to the interview. Is that about like what you've done? Is that a good summary of the data collection and analysis?
It's a good summary. I can go into detail if you want.
Yeah, please.
So YouTube doesn't make it easy. So I started this back in November in 2018. I was using the YouTube API, and to get enough quota, because they limit the amount of requests you can actually make to their API, I created multiple keys, which is against their policy. And they also ask you delete all your data after 30 days. That's also part of their policy. So later, about I think it was October 2019, they cut off my access because I was doing that. So I had to move to just to scraping the website. So now my collection process actually just loads up the website and gets the recommendations from the actual page like a user would. And that's difficult because they block access after a couple of hundred requests. They'll stop that machine from actually requesting from the website. So I need to use a proxy service that's fairly expensive, and what they do is they simulate, or they have actual residential connections, like through your home connection like AT&T, and my requests get tunneled through that in a variety of locations in the States to get a representative kind of sample.
Cool. So the data collection is, would you say that's the hardest part? I feel the labeling of channels is also not so easy, but you've managed to kind of do it half automated, also half collecting things from kind of sources that analyze these channels. But at least for most of the things that I've inspected, I found the labeling to be pretty sane. I think this is always something you can attack. The original paper was also attacked on how they label. I find this to be kind of bickerish. Mostly, I think your labels are pretty good as well. the other papers' labels are also mostly pretty okay.
Yeah.
So let's go to. Sorry.
Yeah, it's quite subjective. I expected the labeling to be what I get most pushback on, but it turns out it was the anonymous collection.
So what you've actually found here, what would you say are your main results? And I can maybe show. So you've analyzed a bit, where do things come from, where do things go to, and I found this part here to be one of the, even though it's pretty simple, one of the core things to say about this is that mostly what you found could be said is it's simply a recommendation algorithm working as a recommendation algorithm should, which means it creates, your typical filter bubbles. If I watch one makeup tutorial, all of a sudden my site is filled with makeup tutorials and things like this. But also you found that there is quite some over-the-top push towards what could be considered mainstream media. And there is a bit of a draw away from the smaller YouTuber-like channels. Is that something that, does that characterize your work?
That's right. So yeah, that's a good way to characterize it. If that chart we're looking at now, if it was a neutral algorithm, the green bars would be the same as the grey ones. So you'd receive the same amount of recommendations as you give. So that would be proportional to the views that you get for your channel organically. The recommendations you receive be equivalent to that. But we find that it disproportionately recommends mainstream media channels. That's not even though, so it's not like it doesn't look like it's consistently doing that. So you can find exceptions to that rule.
Is I believe one of the main criticisms of your paper has been that you only use data from 2019 onwards, and I have actually looked at your website, and your website a lot of times says that the data has been collected from way earlier than that. So is it that you've only used 2019 data in your paper, or what is it?
In the paper's just from November and December 2019, and the reason we did that is that we only had 400 channels before that, and the collection process have changed over time. So this was a clean set of data we could look at, and I thought the most recent was the most relevant. So what is it doing now? But I've got the same analysis over time. So I've got a GIF that I made that everyone can look at, which goes through all the months I've been collecting, and you can see that chart for where it goes to, and has gone through a bunch of changes. So in about April 2019, that's when they really clamped down on conspiracies and other fringe channels. Before that, it was much closer to neutral.
Okay, so
but it never looked like a rabbit hole. It was never favoring fringe channels.
Yeah, I mean that has been my experience also personally on YouTube. I've joined YouTube very early, or I've watched YouTube very early when young Earth creationism was still active, and these things were kind of completely discredited by simply having people exposed to other points of view. And even I find this now, even though YouTube makes it kind of easy to find, let's say, niche content, it also exposes you to a bunch of different views. And I've always found this to be very, very optimistic in the sense of this is probably de-radicalizing much more people than radicalizing. But you've received, like as I said, a bunch of criticism. So if you could, what was the largest criticism, irrespective of whether it was valid or not? What have you found was kind of what most people were criticizing? Most
people were criticizing that we were collecting anonymous recommendations. It wasn't the personalized ones.
Yeah.
And it's actually, like, it is a valid limitation. We had it. There's our first limitation we talked about in this paper. And it's still an open question how personalization would affect these aggregate results that we've got. But I think it's reasonable to assume it will be quite similar once you average it out. So for any one person, it might be different. But you would expect personalization based on someone's history to even out, because it's kind of the algorithm's kind of like the average of all of that when it's anonymous.
Yeah, I feel that's
our assumption.
The notion that because if you're not logged in, the recommendation is like a person with only one video of history, right? So it's the same thing, but there's only one hit point of history instead of multiple. I find why should the behavior be qualitatively different if you have multiple points of history? Like, this is a strong claim that you'd have to really show that there is a qualitative difference, not just a more or less accuracy. And I feel the people making this criticism it's really on them to show that there is a substantial difference, rather than saying that this is a giant limitation of the work.
Yeah, and it's also very hypocritical for a lot of the people saying it, because some of them, like Zainab, who was mockingly saying that her original article in the New York Times used algo transparency, which is anonymous as well, but she never looked into that. And I think a lot of this is completely motivated reasoning. They don't care about the details.
I've seen this one Twitter user, she said something to the effect of, if you've seen this article, please consult someone that works in this space. Like, it's please don't read the article yourself. You must get your information through someone. I've read the article. I found it's pretty straightforward. The limitations are clear, but also the results are pretty clear. And it's actually mostly a boring article, right? I'm sorry, like, it's not a criticism. This is good. Like, it's mostly you find that things work as expected. There is a bit of a push towards mainstream, which can be probably explained in that YouTube wants to be advertiser friendly, right? And these mainstream channels already are advertiser friendly, so they probably get bumped a bit. What would you say is maybe the most valid criticism that you've heard? Maybe not the biggest, but the most, where you say, yeah, this is really something that is,
I think I guess there was criticism that I'm overclaiming, not in the paper so much, but in my tweets and Medium. I guess that's fair, but I guess when I tweet and write in Medium, those are what I believe in kind of a Bayesian way. I'm not couching my claims like you would when you're writing a paper. So I guess that's valid. But I think a lot of people read into what I was saying more than what I was. So when I say the algorithm has a de-radicalizing influence, I'm just talking about the recommendations, whereas a lot of people consider that to be talking about all things considered. So even if it doesn't have a bias towards the fringe, maybe sociologically YouTube radicalizes people. It could be the case. I don't know. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about just the influence through recommendations. And that's all we can hold Google accountable for, or at least it's what we probably all could agree that Google should be held accountable for with its recommendation system.
Yeah. Do you expect something to come, or have you heard something to come out of YouTube themselves, like the company? Any form of official statement to this?
Nothing at all. I got a reporter was complaining that YouTube sent them this. So I think they've read it, but I have absolutely no contact with them. Okay.
Cool. Are you doing anything in follow-up, or do you have plans for more research?
Not at this. I've just gone back to work. I've applied for a bunch of independent grant money, but I'm not optimistic. So if I don't get that, I'll keep it pattering along. I'll probably reduce the amount of recommendations, because I'm spending about $500 a month at the moment, just keeping it running. So I got to reduce my costs.
Yeah, and you do have a Patreon for people to chip into that, right?
Yeah, so if you can link to that, that'd be good.
Yes.
So if I'm getting something like $22 a month, so it doesn't really cover it.
Yeah. All right. So, okay, this has been very, very pleasant. I think we've kind of looked at a lot of things. Is there anything you would like to amend to this that people should know about the research or about this field?
No, just have I encourage people to have a play, dig into the data yourself. There's if you're in this area, the data's free to use, the code's free to use. Just consider this a contribution to knowledge.
Cool. Well, thanks a lot, Mark. I wish you a very pleasant evening for you, I guess. And cheers. Thanks.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Bye.